My name is Trisha Rose, and I'm professor of Africana Studies here at Brown University, and I'm the director for the Center for the Study of Race and Ethnicity in America. I'm really pleased to have developed this series in partnership with the Office of the Provost. We're also very grateful for you to joining us today. We launched this series to instigate informed discussion, debate, and dialogue on race. We simply do not talk enough about race and racism in this country. And when we do, it's too often prompted by a crisis or a tragedy, and there's often more heat than light and not much progress. It was in response to some of the more recent tragic events that we felt compelled to bring to bear the substantial and incredible range of intellectual resources that we have at Brown. Through the research and expertise of faculty like those participating today, we seek to advance knowledge, challenge assumptions, and inspire informed, ongoing discussion and debate on and beyond our campus. This series offers 8 opportunities over the course of the academic year to investigate just a few of the aspects of systemic racism, and in particular, anti-Black racism, as well as the creative responses to it. Our next session, if you would mark your calendars, is set for February 24th, and it's on race and punishment. All of our sessions have been excellent, and I know that today's will not disappoint. I'd also like to thank our panelists for taking time to bring their expertise to us and to share what they know, and to invite us to think more creatively. And I'd especially like to thank my friend and our moderator, Brickson Diamond, who is, in addition to being a proud and generous alumnus of Brown, Brickson is the CEO of Big Answers, which consults on diversity and inclusion strategy for clients in entertainment, technology, and asset management, generating new partnerships and leveraging impactful conversations and connections. He previously served for 5 years as the COO of the Executive Leadership Council, the preeminent member organization of Black executives in the Fortune 1000. And Brickson also began his career and then spent the subsequent 15 years as a marketing and client services executive with the Capital Group companies. He's a founding board member and chair of the Black House Foundation, which provides pathways for Black multi-platform content creators into career opportunities within film, television, digital, and emerging platforms. And Black House has been very influential in creating access and pipeline for Black films and other multimedia creators over the past many years. In addition to Brown, he's a graduate of the Harvard B School, and he serves as a trustee at Brown as well. Finally, when we talked about this particular topic, there was no one better positioned to guide this discussion. And so I'm really grateful that he's accepted my invitation and is zooming in from the West Coast to join us and moderate and care for us today. Brickson, thank you so much and welcome to our program.
Thank you, Professor Rose, and thank you to Provost Locke for this series as well, and the entire team across Brown, where I miss you all dearly. But it's a pleasure to be taking part in this series today and to be joining in this particular discussion. The topic of race and image is so complex, and we're so fortunate to explore some of the threads through the disciplinary lenses offered by these distinguished panelists, professors all. As Professor Rose noted, I work through the Black House Foundation to really create pathways for emerging creators across platforms with a very specific Black lens. And so I'm inspired by still images and moving images to really create possibilities in the world. So that's my perspective, and I'm excited to be here to learn from these great thinkers. Now, let me say a bit about our format today. We'll hear from 3 panelists, each of whom will speak for just under 12 minutes. We've timed them all. There are 11 and certain seconds between them, from their particular and distinct scholarly perspective. Following their remarks, we'll hold all questions until then, and then we'll engage in a Q&A. I will be your voice. I will be the person translating all that you ask in the Q&A section of the wonderful Zoom format. I may also have 1 or 2 questions of my own, so if you don't jump in fast, good luck. And the panelists may have questions for one another and create a bit of a dialogue, but we'll have ample time for your questions if you send them fast and I don't take up all the time. So use that function, the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to submit those questions as we go along, and we'll catch up. We'll try to get to as many of them as we can over the time we have together. We're extremely fortunate to have a depth and breadth of expertise here at Brown and to consider race and image in our society and culture. This is an opportunity to reflect on the very racism this series has sought to explore, and often the racism that our world perpetuates. We have a great deal to cover, so we're going to jump in. And rather than taking any more time with lengthy bios, I will briefly introduce our panelists in order that they can speak, and we'll chat out the link to their full bios so you have those. Our first speaker is Matt Guterl, who is a professor of Africana Studies and American Studies and chair of American Studies here at Brown, a historian of race and the nation, with a focus on United States history from the Civil War to the present. He's written books on race and the progressive era, on Southern slaveholders and the Caribbean, on the history of and cultural context of racial profiling, and on the life of Josephine Baker. Next, we'll hear from Professor of English, Kevin Quashie, who teaches Black cultural and literal studies. He is the author or editor of 4 books, most recently Black Aliveness or A Poetics of Being. Black feminist women's studies has long been central to Professor Quashie's thinking about Blackness. And he also writes and teaches on Black queer studies and aesthetics. Finally, Assistant Professor of Visual Arts, RaMell Ross, will offer his thoughts on this expansive topic from the vantage point of visual artist, filmmaker, writer, and in his words, liberated documentarian. His work has appeared widely in museums and print and online publications in the US and abroad. His feature documentary, Hale County this Evening, won a special jury prize for creative vision at the 2018 Sundance Film Festival, which is where we met. He was nominated for an Oscar, an Emmy, and earned a 2020 Peabody Award. Without further ado, we're going to dive in and get to the talks. Professor Guterl, we're going to start with you. Please join us.
Thank you, Brickson. Thank you as well to Provost Rick Locke and to Trisha Rose, as well as to Marissa Quinn and the media team at Brown for making this all happen. Let me share my slides here. Kevin Seafried roamed the inside of the building. He was carrying a 6-foot-long version of the so-called Stars and Bars, the battle flag of the defeated 19th century Confederacy. The most famous image from the January 6th storming of the US Capitol freezes Seafried in purposeful stride. His dark brows furrowed with consternation, his mouth agape in the midst of speech. A looming portrait of John C. Calhoun can be seen over his shoulder. There were, of course, many other Confederate flags that days, and in the days and weeks and years and decades that led up to January 6th, there have been millions of others too. The modern history of this flag, you may know, begins in the wake of World War II, when the push of the civil rights leaders led President Truman to desegregate the US military. Insurgent Dixiecrats promised to split the Democratic Party and adopted the Stars and Bars as their new flag. As civil rights goals were advanced at the federal level, variants of the flag were incorporated into the landscapes of Southern state houses and into the iconography of the South itself, resurfacing the original meaning of the Confederacy, the state's absolute right to support white supremacy. Since then, the flag has been ubiquitous. It was present at the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, where white men with khakis and crew cuts also carried medieval shields and Nazi flags. And it has been a regular feature at Trump rallies over the past 5 years, animated by the former president's enthusiasm for racial revanchism and his appreciation of army bases named after Confederate generals. On January 6th, held in the hands of Kevin Seafried, it expressed a technicolor wish for the negation of Black life. The iterative power of that flag, its regular return and popularity as an icon of violence and white supremacy, its seemingly endless circulation, should prompt us to think about what enables racist imagery to endure and to flourish. I begin with this photo because it contains a partial answer. Microclimates of fear and anxiety, infrastructures of misinformation, profound demographic and political change, rhetorics of scarcity, and the perverse understanding of national history, bridging mythology and ideology. These factors congeal in our present to ensure that this flag makes us shudder or tear up or quake with rage, or that it inspires perversely on the right. The mere sight of the orange and blue and white flag associated with lost causes now invokes the slow and halting demographic transformation of the United States into a so-called minority-majority country, and the associated concern that white material advantage will be diminished, that white culture will be erased, and that white voices will be silenced. For many, then, it calls out elimination. Of course, a durable icon is not an irrefutable one, and symbols of white supremacy that are meant to clutter our visual horizon and terrorize can also provoke and inspire unpredictably. Black artists, activists, and citizens immediately understood the threat posed by the Confederate flag's resurgence in the post-war moment, and they mobilized clandestinely against it, determined where possible to remove it from their site. Local newspapers from the 1950s and beyond reveal that these symbols were routinely stolen from front porches, state houses, and grave sites. 10, by way of example, were stolen from Richmond's Monument Avenue at the opening of the Civil War centennial in 1960. 14 more were stolen from Baldwin County, Georgia, where they'd been hanging from lampposts. One Confederate flag hanging in Portsmouth, Virginia, was stolen so often over the course of a month in 1961 that town officials were forced to escalate their protection of it. After the first few flags were stolen, the halyards that held the line were fastened halfway up the pole, and when that proved insufficient, the city manager hung the flag with a metal cord, spot welded barbed wire at the base, and coated the pole with non-drying paint, hoping that he might discourage the vandals. Activists promptly broke off the pole at its base and carried the whole thing away. In its place, they left another pennant, which read derisively, "Save your Confederate money, boys." The escalation, struggles to remove or destroy the flag, and state efforts to protect it was a narrative through line of the late Jim Crow era. More recently, this kind of work has moved into the public eye. A man calling himself a representative from the Justice League stole the flag from the state capitol of Alabama in 1990 and told the press that the South won't rise again. In that same year, the founding of the Negro Association for Progress in Austin, Texas, 40 Black organizers stood on the Confederate flag in front of 100 audience members, calling it a symbol of rape, murder, and burning, and then set it afire. In April of 2002, a Black man wearing a Santa Claus suit climbed a ladder on the State House grounds in Columbia, South Carolina, and lit the Confederate flag hanging at the monument to the Confederate dead ablaze. Surrounded by a dozen officers, the man called out that he was burning it for the children. "Why do they have to learn about prejudice?" he asked. In 2015, artist and activist John Sims encouraged a national campaign to bury the old flag on July 4th and recolorized it in black, red, and green, renaming it the African battle flag. All of this history is meant to remind, to underline, to spotlight that Black activists understood the dangerous potential of the Confederate flag from the very moment it was hung atop state houses in the South, understood and militated against it, showing astonishing imagination in the age of Jim Crow and beyond. They in short sought to erase it, to burn it to ash, or to bury it in the backyard, to remove it from their field of view, and to use photography, art, and visual culture to craft counter images. Here, for instance, is Bree Newsom, art student, filmmaker, and activist, balanced at the top of a flagpole. She has a slight smile on her face. One arm holds the Confederate flag out like a prize, and the other grips the pole with determination. Her climbing harness and helmet showcase her planning. In the background, we see the classical facade of the South Carolina State House, and she looks down at the photographer. Newsom tore that flag down on June 28, 2015, just over 10 days after Dylan Roof, a white supremacist, murdered 9 Black men and women gathered together for Bible study at Mother Emanuel Church in Charleston. Photographs of Roof had circulated in the days after his shooting, photographs featuring him posing with the stars and bars. Angered and determined, Newsom and a team of activists had begun planning for a direct action almost immediately. Getting to the top of the flagpole, though, required orchestration. Because of previous efforts to destroy it, the pole was surrounded by a small metal fence. Newsom and James Tyson, her photographer and collaborator, had practiced climbing just such a fence and ascending the pole for 2 days, knowing that she would need to get up quickly to evade early capture. A full media group was present to capture the day on film and to broadcast it around the world. By design, once the police arrived, Tyson and the rest of the team stood back, ensuring that the spotlight was on Newsom, the Black activist. "The Lord is my life and my salvation," she called out, reading Psalm 27 as she descended. "Whom shall I fear?" And then, with her feet back on the ground, she was enveloped by the state, by a Capitol groundskeeper, a state police officer, and a parks officer. "I removed the flag," Newsom told the press later, "not only in defiance of those who enslaved my ancestors in the southern United States, but also in defiance of the oppression that continues against Black people globally. I did it because I am free." One notes the planning, the pictures taken in daylight, the crowds that had gathered before she'd even reached the top, before she'd even had to take down the flag, the presence of that media team. One notes too the history, that fence installed in the wake of countless other efforts to tear that flag down. Newsom's ascent was a piece of radical performance art, planned for public consumption, scripted to be read and reread, primed to be memeable, to endlessly circulate online. But one notes too the dissonance of that struggle, the organizational effort it takes to be seen erasing an image, to have that act, eraser, dismissal, excision, become a counter image with equal, if not greater, power, to ensure that the image that sticks in people's mind isn't the flag itself, but a Black woman tearing it down in broad daylight. There's something equivalent to joy in these small acts, something we might call, following my colleague Aliyah Abdur-Rahman, the Black Ecstatic. Abdur-Rahman describes the Black Ecstatic as an aesthetic performance, a mode of pleasurable reckoning with everyday ruin in contemporary Black lives. What is especially noticeable is Newsom's extraordinary pause at the top of the flagpole. That undeniable sense of electric passion, what Aliyah calls the exuberant pleasures of Black communion. The enticement of photographic capture and the presentation of an ecstatic mode exists in tension with the hard reality of white supremacy, with the reminder of racism's constant backdrop for the everydayness of Black life. For these reasons, another telling image for me isn't this stylized shot of Newsom near the top of the flagpole, filtered and sepia-toned, asserting its status already as a classic. It is the uncurated snapshot taken after Newsom had been arrested at the bottom. A Black police officer holds the flag while a white officer searches her belongings. Newsom, cuffed, smiles at the camera. "I did it because I am free," that smile communicates, offering an ecstatic reckoning with that Confederate flag and the Black life it would deny, offering as well another more utopic representation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor. Powerful, powerful.
Thank you, Brickson. Thank you to Trisha Rose and to Provost Locke, Marissa Quinn and the support team and panelists. Let me share my screen. The world is ever still a difficult place. I hope everyone here today is well and safe. What does it mean? What has it meant historically to look at an image of a Black figure? The question might seem innocent enough, but the truth is that the act of looking at an artistic or even an everyday representation of a Black person becomes entangled with the ways that racial and gendered difference depend upon looking. That difference is invented and confirmed via the seeing of difference. We might think of difference as part of a circular calculation that goes something like this. We know it, see it, represent it, which allows us to see it and therefore to know it all the more. This idea is common among scholars who study visual culture. the ways that visual practice plays a vital role in organizing how we understand the world around us. This is the point historian Sander Gilman makes in his legendary article, Black Bodies, White Bodies, and I'm only going to read the last line, bolded, rather than presenting the world, icons represent it. The work of visual representation, then, is also the work of ideology. We might notice in Gilman's title that this ideological component is not only related to literature and visual art, two fields that are understood to be subjective, but also medical science, a supposedly objective field that relies heavily on representation of the human body in part and in full. My point here is that the act of representing and therefore the act of looking is fraught with all of the terrible histories of the modern world. My second point, if looking is inflected and infected by these legacies of modernity and colonialism, then no act of looking is neutral. There's no easy way to look at an image of a female gendered subject, no uncomplicated way to look at that of a Black subject. This is not a matter of positive or negative representation, but more an acknowledgement of the complicatedness of looking. A quick example. Like many people, I was breathless at the image of Michelle Obama at the inauguration last week. Breathless for all of the serious reasons and the superficial ones too. That belt, that hair, that walk. And still, I have to reckon this breathlessness with the ways that Black women's bodies have been looked at, assessed, dissected, judged, all as a part of determining something about the human rightness or wrongness of their personhood. I have to be careful about what it means to normalize or idealize Michelle Obama. My third point, in the US imaginary, we don't know how to look at Blackness rightly, given that looking is so hard, given the legacies of anti-Blackness that are so under-attended in our representational practices. Here's one example of how complicated Black looking can be. On the screen are 4 images from Whitfield Lavelle. Whitfield Lavelle is an African-American artist that's won a MacArthur Genius Grant. And through this series from his collection titled Kin, he crafts, using charcoal, crafts portraits of Black figures based off of images that he gets from historical archives. And he combines them with an artifact like the cloth flowers in the image at the top or the letter opener at the other image at the top. There was an exhibit of these images and about 16 others at a museum in Massachusetts, and a middle school teacher, a white man, took his 6th grade students to see the exhibit and asked them to go back and to write a story about one of the people in the images. As much as one can tell from reading the class visually, of the 30 students, probably 4 or 5 of them were students of color. I know it's dangerous to size up race in that way, but that's an important thing to say. Every single student of that 30 wrote as if the person they were writing about in the image was a person who was enslaved. And though I think we might have a reading of it that acknowledges that it's good that this cohort of young people understand the legacy of slavery, or maybe they might even be engaging in a kind of Black pessimist reading where they see the afterlife of slavery in the present, there's also something foreclosed about the way in which the icon of a Black figure so readily attends itself to a very limited and certainly the kind of narratives we have of what enslaved people experience as a very limited imaginary. Here's yet another quick example, also about a middle school. This poster, as well as other posters featuring either contemporary movies or contemporary books, was up in a middle school library. Part of the notion of trying to encourage young people to read. And a young white woman came into the library, saw the poster and said, said of Gabby Sidibe, oh, she was in the movie Precious. That was her life story. The librarian in that instance gently pushed back and said, no, that's not her life story. It's based on a book. She's an actor. And the young woman was adamant that it was Gabby Sidibe's life story. I think part of what happens here in this moment is that if that young person was looking at a poster of, say, Jennifer Lawrence in some movie about a hard life, that young person might not have so easily conflated those two things. That is, there's something about the iconography that surrounds Blackness and Black femaleness, maybe even fat Black femaleness specifically, that conflates those things. That is, looking is complicated. I don't have a solution. I'm only presenting sites of trouble. I know that we often rely on figural or realistic representations of Blackness to do certain corrective work, to counter how we Black people are wrongly imaged and wrongly seen. I love seeing some of the astonishingly good images being produced by Black artists in the last 30 years. Kehinde Wiley at the top, Amy Sherald in the middle, Lorna Simpson on the bottom. I know that these images are not only correctives, that they radiate beyond that simple binary. I also know that realist images can do important conceptual work, as Professor Guterl just reminded us. And still, I wonder about the danger of visual representations, what they idealize and normalize, sometimes unwittingly. As such, I'm interested in what it means to see and find Blackness in abstraction too. Let me end then with this image, one of the 60 from Jacob Lawrence's exquisite migration series. It is panel number 46. If you know Lawrence's sequence, you know that it uses a colorful, modified Cubist style to chronicle scenes of Black migration from the first 3 decades of the 20th century. And here I'm just showing you 3 of the panels. Many of the 60 panels have figures in them. Indeed, most of them do. But even in these instances, the figures lack extensive representational detail. In this way, we are being invited to read with abstraction through the simplicity of visual gestures. This one, panel 46, is one of the few of the 60 that doesn't have a human figure in it. No image, no work of art moves me more than this one. This staircase or ladder or tracks for a train that signals both ascent and descent, a trail that doesn't offer direction, just the possibility that movement might happen. And that window with a moon visible, or is it a green door with a golden knob? It is astonishing to me. As I've written elsewhere, I love how Blackness here, and I read Blackness in this image. I love how Blackness is figured not as a legible subject, but as an energy or a capacity, a soft intensity that is thrilling and terrifying. I love the way the perspective here constitutes me, the viewer, as a subject in the visual scene, rather than offering me the image of a subject. It is as if I, Black me, gets to ride or fall or rise in the scene, not be captured by it, as if I am the art itself, rather than being the object of the art. I won't talk about this now, but there's a caption to the image that if people want to ask me about later, I'm happy to talk about in the Q&A. I'll say it again. No work moves me more than this staircase or ladder or tracks for a train that signals both ascent and descent. I am both moved by trying to imagine Lawrence imagining and making this image, as I am moved in beholding myself as the one in the scene of the work, as the one who's reading and can be read in the scale of this ladder, this window, this moon. What would it mean for a young Black person to look at this image and to find something of themselves there? To look at this image and knowing or even not knowing that it was made by a Black artist, to find themselves there, to be called into the practice of thinking, feeling, of paying attention via its abstraction. The value of images, harsh ones or affectingly beautiful ones, is undeniable. They motivate and inspire. The value of images of human beings is even more so. We've seen the way a young Black girl was seized by Amy Sherald's portrait of Michelle Obama. Images initiate the projection of a self beyond the reality of oneself, and as such, they ignite the imaginary. And there are those words: image, imaginary, magi, magic. As Amir Baraka reminds us, these words are all connected. They're holy words. And to engage the image is a holy practice, a habitat and habit of paying attention. So, what holiness then is possible if a Black child looked at image number 46 and found herself there? That across its chasm of space and color, she found herself thrown into ascension and descension, replenished by the splendor not of a figure of herself or someone like her, but by herself indeed, by her thrall, by her abyss, by her possibility, her and this image and her imagination sutured together like a kiss. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Quashie. We are next to our last speaker. And finally, we have Professor RaMell Ross.
Hello, Brickson. Hello, everyone. Yeah, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak and to share ideas. I'm reminded by Professor Quashie's lecture of a line by Henry Brickson, which is that, I think this is his, or it's surrounding his work. I think it's perception is coterminous with memory. And I think that has a lot to do with Black skin, in that, yeah, the act of looking is a social act, of course, and it's obviously towing the history of representation alongside that realization. In thinking about what to talk about today in the context of the ideas and the prompt, I thought about two other quotes. One was James Baldwin's, in that a Black man who is returning to the South from the North is in a land a land he's never seen, but one he can't fail but recognize. And another one was from a pretty influential book for me when I just graduated college, Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. And Robert Persig had a line in there that said, I think, the world has no existence whatsoever outside of the human imagination. And those things are wildly important to my practice and to trying to understand what images mean and what myself as a person of color means in the context of images. And so I started with this image because I made it, and it kind of solidified what I was interested in doing, which was kind of honing into what the South, historic South, Greensboro, Alabama, Hale County, Alabama, looks like from the perspective of a Black male, a perspective of myself. And, you know, you come to realize, which we all know, that, you know, Blackness is something that is a fiction, but it's quite a paradox, because it's a fiction that obviously has produced a nonfiction. And so it's something that we have to deal with every single day. It constitutes our reality. There's real mortal danger in that social construct, but yet it is still a construct. And so a lot of my work is interested in trying to figure out how to even engage in the language of fiction through nonfiction. And the historic South, the American South, is for me the conceptual home for this. And I think, you know, the documentary practice in general is something that is kind of, you know, responsible for the perpetuation of notions of Blackness to some degree, specifically in the American imagination. Documentary practice back in the day was something that was, you know, people would take graphophones to the historic South. They would take pencil and pad, and they would take notes, and it wasn't necessarily something that was as verifiable as we would call photography and film. And the folks that were doing this, one guy specifically, Howard Oldham, was, you know, he had quote unquote good intentions. He believed in Black folks as human beings, but he was what you call enlightened white supremacist. And so he was projecting all of these fantasies about Black people and their spirituality and their fundamental, I guess, slowness and laziness into the way in which he documented people of color. And so the documentary practice itself, whether it's film, whether it's journalism, specifically historically, and then now by default of the trajectory of history, is fraught with the fantasy. And in fact, the ethics of it are also fraught with the fantasy. And so I think that's something to really fundamentally consider, is that perhaps the sort of Eurocentric notion of documentary itself is arguably corrupt in its values, because it produced the fantasy, which is now the nonfiction of our reality, or my reality. And so to me, one of the primary modes of dealing with the problem of representation as it relates to the image is time itself. How do you take time, and how do you put time into the concept of Blackness in order to sort of suspend its meaning, in order to sort of, as Zizek would say, like suspend the horizon, suspend the arc of meaning, so that there's just a sort of paralysis in coming to a conclusion as to what something means or what something is. Black folks in general, I think, speaking from my perspective, of course, fundamentally suffer from knowability. You know, you think you understand the potential of someone, you relate to them with stereotypes, of course, and that mode of connecting with people of color, in which we seem to know what they're up to, or we know what their life is about, I think has a lot to do with the way that images have fundamentally formed an easy mode of consumption for Black identity and Black reality. And so the idea is to create images, therefore, that have this sort of break of conclusion, and they sort of float above a sort of final state, and essentially are not able to be used with the same utility as a typical image of a person of color. I think maybe it was Michelle Wallace, a theorist, said that, you know, Black life, you know, Black folks, African Americans in general, could be sort of summed up cynically, of course, in the word consumption. And so I've wondered to myself, like, how do you make images of people of color that are more difficult to consume, that can't be consumed, that once again sort of float above the popular foreclosing of eternity that happens when you see something that's really familiar and that you sort of encounter every day. And so I spent many years in Hale County, Alabama, making work, and photos like this, which I made and I really enjoy and I think have a value in a certain context, to me became problem images, because they sort of present people in a way that's like very forward facing, and they're sort of easily consumed. I look at this image and I think it's beautiful, and I love the position of the boys and their gesture and their calm and the way that they just sort of are beautiful people. But at the same time, I wonder what the typical American viewer, the typical consumer of images, takes from this image. And it is a process of taking. It's a process. It's conversational, but the conversation is in most cases one-sided and sort of internal with the person that's looking. And, you know, given America's visual constitution, which is one of fundamental racism, I don't present images like this. I'm more interested in images like this, in which the viewer is forced to participate in or with their imagination in order to come to any sort of conclusion. There's so little information about who these boys are and what they're necessarily doing, or just what's happening in this scene. And obviously the semiotics of this are different from the other one. But I think the main thing that's in in that connects the two is Black skin, which, you know, becomes a sort of Rorschach test for one's relationship to the Black community, whether or not you're a person of color or not. And so this image to me reflects back people's relationship to hooded young boys, or young boys in general. You get what you give. And so I also kind of take a similar approach to that with moving images. And I'm going to share a quick little edit I made yesterday of a couple images. I think Hannah's going to play that for us.
Running up this bitch. Ain't nobody. I know it ain't nobody. Y'all ready? Crazy that stuff moving over here. Let's get out of here, man, before it do. Ain't, man. I ain't really gotten in there exactly to get it out, so you can do the spur. I caught it. Hey, why did something? Wait, why did? This is superhuman. This is, hey, nigga, superhuman. Superhuman power. Be like that dude, if I catch it and I throw it and it hit you in the eye, that shit'd be crazy. Yeah, he hit him on tip. Why did? If I do 1,000, it probably hit him in the face. Why did? Stupid leg. You gotta do it like this. All right, Ramel, move your car.
My grandma's house. I get what she used to say. She's gonna be like, "Oh, you went and did something else, just outrageous." I'm like, "Yeah, you love me." That's okay. She expect me to do crazy shit. She's been singing guitar ring for like 2 years now, and I'm never gonna get one.
That was something I made last night at like 4 a.m. that I wanted to use to sort of express this idea very peripherally, because it's you know, it doesn't quite synthesize necessarily in that edit, but some of those images represent what I call the epic banal, which is this space in I think Black representation in real life, that where images and life in its like fundamental sort of quotidian state can take on these sort of epic and almost astrological, like cosmic representational modes. They just sort of exude with a sort of wild. It's more than beauty. It's just like a sort of convergence of like metaphor, truth, and the true momentum of the stream of consciousness, I guess, of Black life. And so I make work that's very, very connected to the sort of documentary tradition of the guys like Howard Odum, who fundamentally, and it's very longitudinal, like 10-year, 12-year documentary projects. And back to Howard Odum, who sort of replaced the work of W.B. Du Bois during that time because of Howard Odum's relationship to institutions, and of course his work being supported. And like those two sort of, I guess, negotiations of modes of making and longitudinal work, I think are, yeah, sort of, I guess, what I'm in love with, because it goes back to the idea of time, in which you're spending so much time, you're spending more time documenting and living a life than anyone else ever would. And so you're capable of representing and registering and making iterations of life that are not possible otherwise. And it's the longitudinal documentary practices are, I think, quite intense political acts, because no one is traditionally willing to spend that much time documenting Black culture. And not no one, obviously there are many people who have taken on projects like this, but to participate in a project in which you're able to iterate something that's so universal but so specific within Black culture is a beautiful thing, and I think has the potential to be a sort of antidote to a lot of these images that we find that have sort of produced the negativity associated with Black skin. And in relationship to time again and moving images, I think the act of looking to connect it back to Professor Quashie's lecture is I think infinitely important, in that, you know, the longer you look at something, let's say you have a word on the paper and it sort of like disintegrates into just letters, and you're like, oh my God, what's a word? What are letters? And then you sort of snap back into it and it sort of unites into something that is a word again. And you're like, oh, language, you know, structuralism, all these things sort of connect to make meaning. That process of looking, the length of time looking, is also a process of deconstruction, and then hopefully reconfiguration. And so I'm a big advocate of taking that active looking process with length, with longitudinal projects, into the concept of Blackness in order to, yeah, hopefully create some new meaning and some new symbols.
Thank you, Professor Ross. And to all of our professors, I want to welcome everybody back in now for the Q&A portion. Professor Guterl and Professor Kwashi, you're back. Welcome. Thank you to each of you for your astute, moving, and at times disturbing subject and remarks. You've gotten us all a lot on the plate to consider. And before I move to questions from the audience, which we have a few of already lined up, I'm going to ask a couple of myself. So first of all, appreciate the lenses through which you all have observed today, but curious about where we can find images of Latinx, Indigenous, and Asian Americans in the body of work in the arts that you would urge us to consider as we think about race in America.
I'll just say a few quick words and refer to the work of my colleague Leticia Alvarado, who's written a great deal about the Latinx representations that deploy the abject aesthetic as a new politics. Her work is extraordinary, and there's an enormous amount of work that's been done on Latinx representations, which both parallel and depart from the Black aesthetic that the three of us have spoken about today.
Great. In terms of Asian American perspectives, anybody have particularly fanboy folks that you all follow?
I mean, my relationship to Asian aesthetics kind of connects to film, and so I'm a big fan of, you know, Apichatpong Weerasethakul's films. He's a Thai filmmaker who is completely breaking every trend and every formal conceit of, I think, Western filmmaking. But to speak on Latinx topics, the Whitney, I think, is doing a lecture series right now, maybe on their second or third. But I would point anyone to that direction, and I think they're presenting some new curators and some fresh voices, yeah, and some new scholarship.
And I would just add that Anne Chang's work, most recent work, Ornamentalism, which thinks about the questions of looking that I think all three of us in different registers were taking up. I think those questions also get taken up, for example, in Anne Chang's work, Ornamentalism.
And a slightly different take on the entire conversation. Can any of you speak to the significance for history and for identity and agency of folks to be observed, right? So the looking is certainly from the view of us, but what is the power of being observed and being recorded and being represented?
I'll take a first start. I mean, I think in Professor Ross's talk, but also the idea of the kind of banal, but also in his film work, there's something, or even in Professor Guterl's talk, there's something about being witnessed, right? And so I think that's part of the complicatedness of these scenes of looking, is that for people who are often not seen or not seen rightly or misseen, and that misseen becomes a part of the violence that happens to them in the world, being seen is powerful and is important, and it's beyond this the register of the personal, and becomes part of a larger social order of witnessing, right? This is the power of, say, representation of genderqueer and gender non-binary folks, for example. This is the importance of me talking about my breathlessness in seeing Michelle Obama. There is something about that kind of being reminded of that person who inhabited the White House and who's part of maybe a re-narrativizing of American history as we know it. So I think it's complicated, this act of witnessing, which is so absolutely essential, and that also has within it these kind of dangerous and unconscious capacities that would to almost undermine some of what the witnessing can do.
Thank you.
I would add, to think back into the 19th century, the power of being witnessed and the power of the gaze was well understood. I'm thinking about Frederick Douglass as the 19th century's most photographed man, somebody who labored, for most of his adult life to be represented as accurately as he felt the camera could capture him, who positioned himself, who adopted a sartorial expression that was quite dignified and radically different than woodcuts or other representations of him that he'd been displeased with. And then ensured as well that everywhere he went, he was photographed, that he would sit for a photograph that would become a postcard that could enter a Black home and become a Black keepsake. The power of being seen and the power of representation is a very old thing. And insofar as the camera's gaze or the ethnographer's look is a very ancient thing, so too is the response, it seems to me. That I think is what the three of us were really thinking about. What does it mean to respond to that gaze, or to acknowledge it, at least, and be aware of it?
And I'll add that it's a profound thing, I think, to be able to sort of recognize the way in which we're conditioned to look, and the way in which the directionality of looking, and also the directionality of the camera. I like to say the god of the camera is a colonizer. And the camera is born in a Eurocentric use of othering. It's a pointing mechanism. And so how is being seen shaped by other people's perceptions? If you have sensitive makers, and there's hundreds and thousands of artists who are sort of reshaping the way that people are seen. When you go out and you make images of people who are fresh, we see ourselves in new ways, and we're capable of imagining ourselves as something other than what we've been taught to think about ourselves as. And so the process of representation, however fraught, is also a process of, of course, creating that new future. And it's on everyone's shoulders.
That's great. So that leads us nicely into Geraldine's question. It is important to acknowledge that Black Americans have been colonized, deferring to white cultural values as the standard. So much so that it is not surprising that many of us participate in justifying our own oppression, including our own children. In your work, do any or all of you explore and receive support practicing decolonization in academia and in your workspaces?
Yes, I think is that the right answer. But I think it's a challenge. Like, we all work in a medieval institution. Like, there are limits to what you can and can't do in a space like this. This conversation is an expression of an attempt on our part to test the limits, but it's not outside of the institution in any particular way. I think we all engage with or at least I know I do. I'll let Kevin and RaMell speak for themselves, but I know that we all engage with the discourse on decolonization and on anti-Blackness in modern institutions in our own ways, and struggle with where we are and the work that we do as professors in an Ivy League institution, in the United States, a settler colonial entity, who are also human beings trying to make a better world.
Well said.
Great. I'll ask this question next. I'll bite. What is the Lawrence's caption on number 46?
The caption reads, quote, "Industries attempted to board their labor in quarters that were oftentimes very unhealthy. Labor camps were numerous," end quote. So Lawrence provides captions, short narrative captions for each of the images. And one of the things in another place where I write about this, one of the things I love about the scope and the heft of the image is that it's not indexed well towards the caption. That is, that the caption is offering, the captions as a whole are offering in some ways a narrative of the Great Migration, and yet the images, by virtue of the way in which images work, especially the kinds of images that Lawrence offers us, the images move a little bit beyond the kind of trajectory of a linear narrative, or a narrative that would to define the historical moment as only that historical moment. And for me, it's number 46 that breaks that, right? Because you've got this thing that looks like it's train tracks, but it could be all of these other things. And the way in which Lawrence is playing with perspective, I think, opens us up to what it is to behold Blackness in the instance of history, at the same time that we also behold Blackness as being, in the ways that I think Professor Ross was talking about, also outside of time, right? Also as being in this kind of ecstatic, to echo back to Professor Guterl's reference to Aliyah Abdur Rahman's terrific article, ecstatic outside of the case of time and history, that would only to understand Blackness through scenes of limited interpretations of subjection. So it's a long-winded answer, but that's a caption.
Thank you, thank you. That was from Nancy, and from Nell, I think it is, and this is the language in this question is fascinating if you take the continuum of a Black struggle in America. Could the panelists please comment on the power of the image and of particular images, given the fire hose of images in current media culture? Which images stick and shape politics and culture, and why those rather than others?
You know, I'm personally invested in looking at real world Black folks, because images and like Black life is always more than images. It's always better than images. It's always more, I personally believe, more ecstatic than images. I think the fundamental essence, the fundamental being itself, is the sort of site for me of the inspiration, because I think that, you know, I would argue, just provocatively, I guess, that we've never seen a Black man before because of the cultural residue. You could also say we've only seen a Black man, and both are problems. And so the process of representation is a constant conversation with that. That's more abstracted. And I think that abstraction provides a wonderful relief and a possibility to transcend, if that's the language you want to use, and also just a site to analyze. But the process of being the sort of the fundamental continuous moving target of the social concept of Blackness in its like populating you know, flux that is real life, to me is where I get a lot of my inspiration from, and it, you know, is a source of yeah, is the source of work, and is the challenge to see what's really there, I guess.
Just gonna say, I really love that we've never seen a Black man before. We've only seen a Black man, and one could extend that across other registers of identity. I think the part of why I lean in this moment to abstraction, and if people are interested, Philip Bryan Harper has a fantastic book called Abstractionist Aesthetics that's worth the read. Part of the turn to abstraction is the same. It's the same impulse that I think pulls Professor Ross to the image of the three figures on the playground swings in hooded coats, whom you can't see their faces, is also the same impulse of Professor Guterl doing that kind of fine-grained reading of the very last image of the, I can't remember her name now, but after she's come down from reading and thinking with her smile, there's this attempt, there is this work we have to do in this country, and I'll just say in this country for the sake of grounding it specifically, to figure out how to learn to see again because of the kind of embeddedness of these histories. And it's also, again, just part of not wanting to idealize and normalize, say, Michelle Obama in that fantastic, I mean, you know, I ran out and bought a whole bunch of belts that I now want to start wearing after I saw Michelle Obama. But I also know that there are ways in which there are things about idealizing that human being who in and of themselves can't be the standing for what Black everyday grace is. And so I think that's part of the challenge. I'm sorry, Matt, go ahead.
No, I don't. I wish I could just, I mean, those are answers I wish I had given myself. They are both beautiful. And to them, I would only add, to sort of circle back to the original question, that there's a media ecology that dictates how some images appear on CNN and some don't. And there's a psychological ecology that determines why some stick with us. And you know, I think what RaMell said at the very, very beginning, you know, sometimes these images stick because they are, whether we admit it or not, what we want to see. And Kevin's calling us to wrestle with that, with the desire to see some things and to linger on them and to fix them as the one representation of a moment, or the one representation of an epoch. That there are consequences for that desire, and those consequences are about who we are and who we want to be, and also about, you know, what we want and don't even know we do sometimes.
Mm-hmm. A slight shift here to an anonymous question that talks about signification. So what of the U.S. flag as an image and its relation to race? You know, on a private residence, on a public building, at a sports event, on a moving vehicle. What do we say about the meaning of the U.S. flag as it currently exists today? In contrast, I think, to Professor Guterl, some of the other images of flags that we may have seen throughout these talks.
I almost want to hear what Kevin and RaMell have to say first. But you know, I think all flags are symbols that are easily turned into toxic icons. You know, a flag is a rallying cry for the nation state, and the nation state is an extremely problematic historical construction. We happen to live in one. The flag is a useful identifier on our passports, but it's a problematic symbol for us to rally around. And the ease with which the American flag has appeared on pennants next to the Trump flag and the Confederate flag, or various and other flags that have come to symbolize the libertarian right, should frighten us and should make us trouble the display of the flag and make us wonder whether or not that's a healthy, sane, truly humane move.
So I'm going to come to Ernest's questions. Are there ways of using the camera that step out of the historical problems you've described? When those new image makers are colonized, how can they be outside the ideology they are born and educated into?
No, I would argue that all three of us are makers, at least according to our presentations. Well, it's a big problem, and I think, you know, the only way to deal with race obviously is to acknowledge it and then move forward with that knowledge. And I think the only way to deal with the problems of the camera are to know the problems of the camera, know about the directionality of the camera, know the sort of fundamental gathering of all images into an industry which, you know, produces likes and produces a value system that doesn't let images necessarily exist without the utility of a certain industrial purpose. I think for me, the biggest thought experiment I have with the camera itself, holding the camera and using it as a mechanism is trying to, you know, employ the camera as an organ. So how do you sort of take the camera into your body? How do you use it as an extension of consciousness? Not something that's separate from you, something that's inside of you. So sort of double down on your subjectivity through images. You double down on your subjectivity through knowing your, you know, if you think about the way in which people are educated, or at least in the US with writing, like we write and we learn the alphabet our entire lives, right? Like we're writing essays to get into school, but people aren't visually literate in the same ways. Like we don't learn how to write with images, and we don't learn how to read images. And that problem produces the perpetuation of the history that's within the problem of images. And so one, it's education, and then it's also thinking about, I think, the directionality of the camera. But to finish is once you take it into your body, to me, it's reckoning with, once again, the camera, the god of the camera being a colonizer, and thinking about possibly what the camera would look like inside the zeitgeist of other religious formations. And I use religious formations just because they're very sort of prefab structures of being, but like, you know, what would it look like in the hand of a Buddhist? That's like, what if the camera was born in Hinduism? What if it was born in Buddhism? They have different concepts of reality. We use the camera, I think, in a very Christian way. And so, you know, just as a thought experiment, like, how do you play with those ideas?
And to that point, Professor Ross, there's a question anonymous. In our globalized age, with people of color and immigrant populations introducing new art and culture, does Black iconography culture shift as well, despite the language and cultural differences?
Yeah, I think all of it's up for grabs. I think one of my favorite quotes from Bell Hooks is the only site for resistance for Black culture was the family archive. And you think about the way that everyone has access to kind of creating their own archive, but all of a sudden the archive turning into, or being part of the sort of Facebook like cycle, and no longer being those sort of authentic depictions for the sake of depictions. And so I say that in terms of the meaning of Black images, potentially, in that, you know, there's always space for re-signification. There's always space for changing the values. Blackness is, you know, like most other social constructs, like nations are as mobile as the beliefs of the people who behold them. And so just a process of mobiling people to think differently and employ images differently, and it's going to change the meaning. That's what meaning is. Meaning is very, very rarely stable, I think. But I don't know. I really don't know.
Any other thoughts or comments on this question around the globalization and sort of the shift in meaning?
There's a really wonderful and talented Africana Studies PhD here working on the way in which Black filmmakers cast the diaspora in films that are about ostensibly domestic topics. You know, thinking about something like Selma, for instance, which has an international cast and then represents that global cast as a U.S. Group of actors. And I think that raises the questions that RaMell has just raised as well. Like, what is the meaning of that, and what is the power of that, and what are the politics of it, and the consequences of it? And I think it's a fascinating question. I can't wait to see how it shakes out as globalization increases and these kinds of casting decisions are made even more radically.
As we wind down, I thank everyone for their questions. I'd love to pose and give the opportunity for each of you all to give closing thoughts and directions for us as we navigate the dynamics that you have so well laid out before us. What do you want us to do? So I think that's the call to action, the next steps. What's the homework, professors, for those of us on the Zoom? Who wants to start? I know y'all like to give homework, so come on. Don't be shy. Don't be shy now. Professor Guterl.
I think if I'm trying to summarize what the three of us have been saying, but then I think we're also building out from that. I hear a call for mindfulness, careful study, thoughtfulness, humility before an image, before framing an image, before sight. that these are necessary first steps to try to ensure that when and where we enter the visual realm, we understand, how a photograph was taken, who arranged for it to be taken, how a film was made, who arranged for casting decisions, what an artist has represented and has not represented, how that representation fits what others have done and have not done. That the study of this stuff should precede any action and should be extensive.
I would just add that it's almost something antithetical to the way in which we're organized as communities in the United States and even globally in a social media era. But it's slowness, right? It's about everything does feel urgent, and sometimes there's a need to figure out how to respond urgently, and I believe in that. But I think there's also, and I heard Professor Rose saying this at the very beginning about the series, that we so often are responding to scenes of crisis that what we miss is the opportunity to figure out, well, how do we practice how we want to be and think and spend time with these issues so that when we are in those crises that we are practiced in that mode. And so for me, I would go back to what does it mean to spend time seeing and thinking about how we see and what we recognize, which is echoing what Professor Guterl just says. I think of it as entirely a spiritual practice, right? That matter of paying attention. The earlier question about the American flag, I think maybe in the last 15 years or so, every time I see an American flag, I try to remind myself to think about the different instantiations that flag has gone through and what that means. I try to remind myself of that, like the practice of someone deciding we need that flag and what it displaces by virtue of it being instantiated, which that's the kind of everyday work that one can't do every moment because it's exhausting, and because part of being human is you also have to navigate your life. But I think each of us can figure out for ourselves, where can we deepen our attentiveness? And so that's what I would say.
I'd like folks to remember that I've said this many times before, that, I believe on one hand, photography and film are the technology of racism. They're the means of materializing, what, Professor Kwashi said, of making tangible the idea, essentially, of Blackness and everything that comes along with it. And so with that being said, to me, it is about, kind of taking a time out, like pausing and slowing down and figuring out ways to have things be employed for purposes outside of their traditional purposes. How do you make images of ourselves and other people, that serve a variety of different purposes that aren't single use? I'm very interested in a strategic ambiguity when it relates to images of people of color. How do you embed complexity so that the viewer, there's no way for them to figure anything out without them completely projecting their imagination into it? And so, yeah.
Great. Thank you all. So as we wrap and give a few more minutes back, because I know we could go on for a very long time, because this is incredibly illuminating and I think transforming for us was all in terms of our perspectives. I'd like to conclude though by thanking everyone who made this event possible. Thanks to CSREA, the Provost Office for conceptualizing the series, to Media Services and University Events for their skilled support, to our panelists, Professor Guterl, Professor Kwashi, Professor Ross, but also Professor Rose, Marissa Quinn from the Provost Office, Hannah Little, Soraya McPherson, Megan Silvestri, and of course, Sarah and Jess, our interpreters, our ASL interpreters. We thank the two of you as well. And of course, thank you all for attending, asking your exceptional questions, and for engaging in this critical work. So on behalf of the entire team assembled today, we encourage you to register for future events. The series continues, and there are instructions in your chat to come back early and often, and also to contribute your thoughts as to what would be useful for future events. We are sad not to be together in so many circumstances, but grateful for the opportunity to gather to benefit from the great knowledge that professors on our campus embody and deliver to our students every day. So with that, on behalf of the corporation and myself and all involved in this effort, I thank you all. Enjoy the day.
Thank you, Brickson.
Thanks, everybody.
Brickson.